Welcome back to the top 100 trades in NBA history. If you haven't seen part 1 and 2, I recommend you check it out. But kicking off part 3 at number 50, we have Kevin Johnson to the Suns. Though he's not often talked about today, Kevin Johnson was one of the best point guards of the 1990s with 3 All-Star appearances to show for it. He could consistently score 20 points and 10 assists a night, and he spent most of his career, which was over a decade, playing for the Suns in the aftermath of this trade. What it took to acquire him was giving up their star wing Larry Nance as well as Mike Sanders in a first-round pick, and in exchange, the Suns got Kevin Johnson, Tyrone Corbin, Mark West, a first-round pick, and 2 second-round picks. It was worth giving up Nance in order to acquire Kevin Johnson, because if you look a few years ahead, the Suns landed Charles Barkley, who was their MVP-level wing. He actually did win the MVP award in 1993, and alongside Charles Barkley, the Suns won 62 games and made it to the NBA Finals, being 2 games away from taking down the Michael Jordan-led Bulls and winning the championship. And although they didn't get over the hump, this Suns team was still one of the most dominant teams of the 1990s. And much of the credit goes to Kevin Johnson, who was an all-star level guard with elite playmaking and strong slashing ability. Another feature of this trade that moves it up the list is that the Suns traded for him when he was an unproven rookie, and he later became a most improved player in a Suns uniform. I love my buy low trades. Coming up next at number 49, we have Adrian Dantley to the Jazz. When I say 30 point per game scorer, Adrian Dantley is probably not a name that comes to mind. But in 7 seasons with the Utah Jazz, Adrian Dantley averaged 30 points a game on a remarkable 56% from the field, and also landed 2 scoring titles as well. All of this while playing for the Utah Jazz following this trade. They picked him up early in his career, so what it took to acquire him was a 1-for-1 swap in which the Lakers got Spencer Haywood and the Jazz got Adrian Dantley. With the Jazz, Dantley became a 6-time All-Star, and although the Jazz were a pretty bad team for his first couple of years there, eventually they started to turn it around, and Dantley was able to lead this Jazz team to the second round of the playoffs a couple of times, and they didn't make it much further than that. But this trade doesn't make it onto this list for playoff success. He landed on this list because of his scoring dominance. He was an absolute beast at scoring the ball. 2 scoring titles is what he has to show for it. And to this day, he still has the 3rd most points scored in Utah Jazz franchise history. Despite spending less than a decade there, Adrian Dantley was an absolute bucket. The next trade we have on the list is Charles Barkley to the 76ers. We know Charles Barkley today as one of the most legendary sports commentators in the game, but he also was one of the greatest power forwards to ever play the game, and most of his prime came when he was playing in a Sixers uniform. He started off competing alongside Julius Irving in the Eastern Conference for a Sixers team that was just a few years removed from winning the NBA championship, and then over the years developed into a star of his own right, coming as close as the runner-up to the MVP award one year, and also racking up multiple All-NBA first and second teams as soon as his second year in the league. But they wouldn't have landed him if in 1978 they didn't trade away their star guard World B. Free to the Clippers for a first-round pick in 1984, which would come 6 years after this trade happened. But this draft class also happened to be one of the greatest draft classes, if not the greatest draft class in NBA history, and this pick turned into the 5th overall pick, which the Sixers used to take Charles Barkley. Did they know 6 years prior that this draft class was going to be one of the greatest the league has ever seen? Who knows? But landing the round mound of rebound is enough to make this trade worthy of a ranking on this list, because he was a stellar power forward that is one of the greatest to play his position. The next trade we have is Penny Hardaway to the Magic. This era is largely remembered for Penny Hardaway being the accomplice to a young Shaquille O'Neal, but don't forget that Penny Hardaway was actually top 3 in MVP voting one year, which was in 1996, Shaquille O'Neal's last year with the Magic. So really, you can think of Penny and Shaq as co-stars, which is really impressive when considering in just his second year in the league, the Magic made it all the way to the NBA Finals in 1995. So this team was no joke, and Penny Hardaway was a legitimate superstar in his first couple of years in the NBA. On draft night, the hype wasn't surrounding him though, it was surrounding the number 1 overall pick Chris Webber, who the Magic actually traded away for Penny Hardaway and 3 first-round draft picks. Again, Penny Hardaway was a superstar level talent in his first couple of years with the Magic, with an elite slashing ability that made for some pretty sick highlight reels. And this Magic team was so good alongside Shaquille O'Neal that they made it all the way to the finals. This team was legit, but after Shaq left, they didn't really get any more success in the playoffs. That was pretty much it. They never got past the first round with just Penny Hardaway as the lead star. But this trade is still excellent considering the fact that it was seen as insane to trade away Chris Webber. The hype was so high, but instead they got an all-NBA first-team level point guard and 3 first-round draft picks. This trade was brilliant. The next trade we have is Ray Allen to the Celtics. The trade that completed the big 3 in Boston between Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, and Ray Allen. Or you can call it the Big 4 if you want to include a young Rajon Rondo. But this move alongside the Kevin Garnett trade were both moves that changed the Celtics from being just a 24-win team to a 66-win team in just one season, because the Celtics knew that they had to land competitors if they wanted to make it back into the playoffs and be a real contender with their star Paul Pierce. And Ray Allen was that guy. He was 32 years old, but he was still on top of his game as a shooter. In fact, probably the greatest three-point shooter of all time at that point. And it cost so little to land him that it almost looks silly in hindsight. They traded away Wally Szczerbiak, Delonte West, and a second-round pick. And in return, they got Ray Allen and Glenn Davis. And again, in just one season, the Celtics turned around from being a bottom of the Eastern Conference franchise to the very top of the Eastern Conference, and in fact, NBA champions, with Ray Allen averaging 20 points and shooting a ridiculous 52% from 3 in the NBA Finals series against the Lakers. The risky move to land a 32-year-old star to compete for a championship paid off, and the Celtics have their 17th championship banner to show for it. Up next, we have Vince Carter to the Raptors. When you're a new franchise entering the NBA, it's even more important to make moves that will make your brand of basketball interesting enough to attract a fan base so the franchise is able to stay in the league. And for the Raptors, there was no better way to do this than by acquiring Vinsanity, who had some of the most insane highlight reels of the era, and his flashy slashing ability is still remembered to this day as iconic. In 1998, the Raptors were just 3 seasons old and hadn't won more than 30 games. But on draft night in 1998, they traded away the 4th pick Anton Jamison to the Warriors in exchange for the number 5 overall pick Vince Carter and cash. With this trade, the Raptors basically had their sights set on a prospect that they knew was going to change their franchise, so they traded back 1 pick just to get a little cash in the process. But with the Raptors, Vince Carter built his reputation as the greatest dunker in NBA history, which made Raptors basketball exciting to watch, which they needed. He even led this franchise to multiple playoff appearances, the best run they had being in 2001 when they were 1 game away from taking down the Allen Iverson MVP year Sixers in a series where Vince Carter really did everything he could. He scored 30 points a night on incredible efficiency, but this Raptors team was just not well-rounded enough. Overall, from the perspective of a new and unproven franchise, there's really no better deal that could have ever been made than the one to land Vince Carter. At the number 44 spot, we have Dave DeBusschere to the Knicks. If DeBusschere is somebody that you're unfamiliar with, then you're probably wondering if this move is significant enough to be on this list. However, this is a trade that directly led to the Knicks winning 2 championships in the 70s, the only 2 championships in franchise history to this day. The move to land him involved trading away Walt Bellamy and Howard Komives to the Pistons in exchange for the 3-time All-Star Dave DeBusschere. Before this trade, the Knicks were either struggling to make it into the playoffs or were getting knocked out in the first round. But in his first full season with the Knicks won the NBA title, with DeBusschere averaging 19 points per game in the finals, which is even more impressive when considering for every single year he played with the Knicks, he made the all-defensive first team every year. So this deal was an incredible move to land a 2-way championship difference maker. The next trade we have is Rip Hamilton to the Pistons. I like my trades that are championship difference makers, and the 2004 Pistons are a unique roster that didn't stand out with just one particular superstar, but a team composed of multiple star, maybe all-star level talents that cohesively played basketball together so well that they were able to rise over the top and win the championship. And Rip Hamilton was one of those stars. He was an elite mid-range scorer who was giving the Pistons 20 a night, while also being a strong perimeter defender in his own right and making 3 All-Star appearances during his time with the Pistons. The Pistons got him 3 years into his career in 2002 when they traded away Jerry Stackhouse, Brian Cardinal, and Ratko Varda in order to land Richard Hamilton, Hubert Davis, and Bobby Simmons. Again, Rip Hamilton's contributions to a Pistons team that was consistently competing for championships cannot be understated enough. For instance, in the year they won the title, 2004, Rip Hamilton averaged nearly 45 minutes a night during the finals and also led the Pistons in scoring in that series. Beyond just 2004, this Pistons team was one of the best teams to come out of the Eastern Conference in the 2000s. They were consistently winning 50 and 60 games a season and made multiple conference finals appearances. Even the year after they won the championship in 2005, they were 1 game away from going back-to-back in a series that Hamilton did unfortunately struggle to score the ball in. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Rip Hamilton's role as a two-way scorer that could knock down mid-range shots and play perimeter defense was vital for the Pistons consistently competing year after year in the Eastern Conference and ultimately winning it all in 2004. And making the move to acquire a top scoring option and a foundational piece to a championship competing team is why this trade ranks highly on this list. At the next spot we have Kyle Lowry to the Raptors. If you're unfamiliar with the earlier part of Kyle Lowry's career, then you probably would have thought that Kyle Lowry was drafted to the Raptors, but this is not true. He actually spent his first 6 years playing for the Grizzlies and the Rockets and being basically not much better than a role player. But it was when the Raptors acquired him that he became the multiple-time All-Star that we know him as today. In 2012, they traded away Gary Forbes and a first-round pick in order to land Kyle Lowry, and it was about a year or two after this trade that Kyle Lowry erupted into the pivotal piece that we knew him as a Toronto Raptor, delivering impressive scoring with a peak of about 22 points a game, elite playmaking with a peak of about 9 assists a game, and also being a pretty tough playmaker in his own right while knocking down 3-point shots on a high volume and pretty efficient rate, and playing some hard-nosed and respectable defense, especially for somebody that's just 6 feet tall. What's more, this Raptors team eventually came together into a championship team in 2019, mainly due to the acquisition of Kawhi Leonard, but Kyle Lowry was still there as the heart and soul of the Raptors, averaging 16 and 7 in the finals series to take down the Warriors. So Kyle Lowry built his legacy in a Raptors jersey, making 6 All-Star appearances and bringing home the first title in franchise history, while the move to acquire him was a buy low trade because at the time he was an unproven and unestablished talent. So if you're a Raptors fan, everything about this deal is just excellent. At the number 41 spot, we have Bill Sharman to the Celtics. The trade that marks the oldest trade that we will see in this ranking going back to 1951, over 70 years ago. So the game of professional basketball was young at this point. But that doesn't change the fact that Bill Sharman made 8 All-Star games, 7 All-NBA teams, won 4 championships, and when it was all said and done, made the Hall of Fame. The trade to land him was a 1-for-1 swap in which the Celtics gave up Chuck's share in order to get Bill Sharman. Fun fact, this trade happened because Bill Sharman refused to sign with the Pistons, so instead he spent his career playing for the Celtics, consistently averaging 20 points a game, and to this day ranks 15th in highest career free throw percentage in NBA history. For these reasons, this trade is the first great trade the league has ever seen. The next deal we got is the trade that sent Clyde Drexler to the Rockets. At this point, a longtime trailblazer, Clyde Drexler spent his last 3.5 years for the Rockets, which is a short time, but make no mistake about it, Clyde Drexler was still on top of his game until his last days in the league. To pick him up, the Rockets traded away Otis Thorpe, Marcelo Nicola, and a first-round pick, and in exchange, they got Clyde Drexler and Tracy Murray. This is a deal that had an instant payoff because at this point, Michael Jordan was only going to return for the last 20 games of the season, so the NBA title was up for grabs. Landing Clyde Drexler made him the second option to their superstar Hakeem Olajuwon, and they won the championship as soon as they got him, with Drexler averaging 21.5 points, 9.5 rebounds, which is insane for a shooting guard, and 7 assists in the final series where they swept the Magic to win the title. So literally half a season after he left the Blazers, Clyde Drexler silenced all doubts that claimed that he was incapable of winning championships. After this year, he spent his last 3 full seasons in a Rockets jersey, making the All-Star game for the first two and still averaging 18 points a night in his last year in the league. Overall, the Clyde Drexler Rockets era was a pretty graceful way to end his career, and the trade paid off just half a season after it was made. At the number 39 spot, we have Dennis Johnson to the Celtics. If you haven't noticed already, championship difference makers get ranked very favorably on this list. And after this move, DJ played point at an all-star level for a team that won 2 championships and played a brand of basketball that is some of the best the league has ever seen. In order to bring him to the Celtics, they traded away Rick Roby and 2 second-round picks to the Suns, and in return, they got Dennis Johnson, a first-round pick, and a third-round pick. Dennis Johnson's identity on the Celtics team was being a lockdown perimeter defender, being a Defensive Player of the Year candidate in just his first year with the Celtics. He was also the lead playmaker, averaging 6.5 assists in his 7 years with the Celtics. And although he didn't need to, he could still score the ball, scoring the second most points for Boston in the 1984 finals, which they won. DJ was by no means deserving of the superstar label, but that's not what was required of him on a Celtics roster that was so stacked that they won as much as 67 games in 1986. For what was expected of him, DJ played his role excellently and should forever be remembered as a pivotal piece of the 1980s Celtics dynasty. At number 38, we have Chris Paul to the Clippers. Probably the best point guard in the league, wanted out of New Orleans at this point, and after a famous veto of the trade that would have sent him to the Lakers, Chris Paul still needed somewhere to go. He still ended up in Los Angeles though, because the Clippers traded away Eric Gordon, Al-Farouq Aminu, Chris Kaman, and a first-round pick in order to bring in Chris Paul and a second-round pick. This trade was very much worth it, given that Chris Paul became the face of the Clippers franchise for all 6 years that he played for them. What's more, this struggling Clippers franchise could use some excitement, and Chris Paul was the engineer of the Lob City offense that produced highlight reels that are still iconic to this day. But he played at this elite level on both ends of the ball because he made the all-defensive first team all 6 years that he played with the Clippers. He ranked 3rd in MVP voting in just his first year with the Clippers, and also led the league in assists twice with the Clippers and led the league in steals 3 times. Now unfortunately, this didn't always translate to the playoffs, and this Clippers team never even made it to the conference finals. But that doesn't change the fact that CP3 was the face of some of the best rosters we've seen in Clippers franchise history, and with that in mind, the package to land him looks remarkably cheap in hindsight. Next up, we have Chris Webber to the Kings. Chris Webber is a Hall of Famer that spent most of his prime years with the Kings, being one of the best players in the NBA and leading a Kings team that was one of the greatest threats to the Lakers dynasty. To land him, they traded away their longtime star Mitch Richmond, who actually ranked at number 87 on this list for when he was traded to the Kings, and they also traded Otis Thorpe, and in return they got Chris Webber. While Mitch Richmond was an excellent scorer, his prime years were coming to an end. So this trade ushered in a new era of Kings basketball that was much more competitive when compared with their teams in the 90s. Webber was a beast at scoring the ball, averaging as much as 27 points a game at his peak, and he also led the league in rebounds one year, his first year with the Kings actually, averaging 13 rebounds a game. And even though this team constantly got bested by the Lakers, they were 1 game away from the NBA Finals in 2002 before losing in Game 7 to the Lakers. In that series, Chris Webber played his heart out, averaging 45 minutes, 24 points, 11 rebounds, and 6 assists a night, which by the way is really impressive for a power forward. Chris Webber was maybe at his peak one of the best playmaking bigs we've seen in basketball. So even though this Kings team was unable to take down the dynasty Lakers, this move landed the Kings the face of their franchise that led, to this day, some of the best Kings teams in their franchise's history. Next up, we have Jason Kidd to the Nets. The leader of one of the best teams to come out of the Eastern Conference in the 2000s. They made multiple finals appearances under Jason Kidd's leadership. There's a reason why Jason Kidd is often ranked as a top 10 point guard in NBA history, and a big reason is because he was so impactful on both ends of the ball, leading the league in assists per game multiple years in a row, and often leading the league in steals as well, making multiple all-defensive teams during his time with the Nets. In 2001, the Nets traded away Stephon Marbury, Johnny Newman, and Soumaya Samake to the Suns in order to land Jason Kidd and Chris Dudley. They traded away Marbury, a guy who was coming off an all-star season in which he averaged 24 points and 7.5 assists, But what they got in return was a guy who was the runner-up for MVP in his first year with the Nets, literally doubling the Nets win total from 26 to 52 games won. And this was because Jason Kidd was the engineer of the Nets offense. In that same first year with the Nets, he averaged about 10 assists a night and was close to scoring the most amount of points for the Nets because this Nets team did not actually have a 15-point per game score. But don't get it twisted, this Nets team was still a threat because they ranked first in the league in defensive rating. They were a lockdown defensive team, and Jason Kidd had much to do with that. He made the all-defensive first team and averaged 2 steals a night. And for that reason, this Nets team made it all the way to the NBA Finals in both of Kidd's first 2 years with the team, getting swept by the Kobe and Shaq Lakers in the first year and being 2 games away from taking down the Spurs in 2003. Overall, Kidd built a reputation for being one of the best playmakers and lockdown perimeter defenders in the league, for one of the best defenses the league had seen in the 2000s, and also a consistent threat in the Eastern Conference. With this trade, they took a risk by trading away their number 1 scoring option and all-star, but it paid off massively, and because of this deal, the Nets had some of their best playoff success to date under Jason Kidd's leadership. The next trade we have is Sidney Moncrief to the Bucks. Moncrief is a Hall of Famer who built his reputation as one of the best defensive guards to ever play basketball and also the face of a team that was one of the biggest threats in the Eastern Conference during the 1980s. On draft night in 1979, the Bucks traded back 1 pick from number 4 overall, which the Pistons used to draft Greg Kelser, to draft Sidney Moncrief at number 5 overall, and also got cash in this package. Moncrief spent a decade with the Bucks, making 5 All-Star appearances and winning 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards. And although they never made it past the Dynasty Celtics, this Bucks team was no stranger to winning 55 and 60 games a season. And Moncrief's strong playoff play is a large reason why this Bucks team was able to make multiple deep playoff runs. On draft night, they recognized that they were landing a guy that would later become a 20-point per game lockdown defender and a playoff competitor during his prime, and for that reason, it was an excellent move to trade back to acquire him. At the number 34 spot, we have Ben Wallace to the Pistons. This is the third and final trade involving a player from the 2004 championship Pistons roster. The other 2 being Rip Hamilton, as we talked about earlier in this video, and Rasheed Wallace in part 1. And although Wallace didn't score nearly as many points as these 2 guys, what separates him from those 2 is the fact that he was the defensive anchor of this Pistons team, which was one of the best defensive teams in basketball. And what's more, he wasn't just any ordinary defensive anchor, he was one of the best defensive players to ever play the game, winning 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards during his time with the Pistons. To this day, that puts him tied for first for the most amount of times having won this award, with Dikembe Mutombo and Rudy Gobert. Another unique feat about this trade is that the Pistons traded for him when he was not yet an established talent. He was nothing more than just a starting big for a struggling Magic team, and wasn't considered to be more than just a throw-in in the deal that sent him and Chucky Atkins to the Magic in exchange for the Pistons' former star wing, Grant Hill. While Hill battled injuries in Orlando, Ben Wallace was assigned with the task of guarding star big men like Shaquille O'Neal and Tim Duncan in the biggest stage of basketball, the NBA Finals, and Wallace was up for the challenge, especially when the Pistons won it all in 2004, taking down the Kobe and Shaq Dynasty Lakers. Ben Wallace lives on to this day as a Hall of Famer and one of the best traditional big men of the 21st century, and with this move, the Pistons rightly recognized his potential before it came into fruition. At number 33, we have Gail Goodrich to the Lakers. A player not often thought about as one of the best players in Lakers franchise history, but he definitely was one of the most important players on the Lakers championship rosters prior to the Showtime era. I mean, here we're talking about a guy that could really score the ball. At his best year, he averaged 26 points per game on a Lakers team that won 69 games and the championship. This 26 point per game average also put him 5th in points per game, making him one of the best scorers in the league. And in the series which they won the title against the Knicks, Gail Goodrich had the most points scored. 2 years prior to this, they traded away a big named Mel Counts in order to land Gail Goodrich. And this was a Lakers team that failed to win the championship despite competing every year due to the Bill Russell Dynasty Celtics. And although Bill Russell was retired and the Lakers also picked up Wilt Chamberlain, Gail Goodrich and his scoring ability was still a huge difference maker for this Lakers team, as he became the lead scoring option and a 4-time All-Star for the Lakers. And of course, they won the championship in 1972. So if you ask me, Gail Goodrich is underrated both in his trade value in this deal and by fans to this day. The next trade we have is Oscar Robertson to the Bucks. The Big O is considered one of the best point guards to ever play the game, but during most of his prime, he did not have an NBA championship because he was playing for a struggling Cincinnati Royals team that could never get over the hump against the Bill Russell-led Celtics dynasty. But Bill Russell retired in 1969, and 1969 was also the year the Bucks drafted Lew Alcindor, otherwise known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and he was an MVP candidate in his rookie year, so the Bucks knew it was time to compete. That's why in 1970, the Bucks traded away Charlie Paulk and Flynn Robertson in order to get Oscar Robertson from the Royals. They only got Oscar Robertson for the last 4 years of his career, but that was more than enough because in his first year with the Bucks, they won the NBA championship in 1971. And this wasn't a carry job by Kareem either, because Oscar Robertson averaged 23.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 9.5 assists in the finals. In all 4 of these years, the Bucks were consistently competing because they didn't lose less than 59 games with Oscar Robertson on the squad. Even in the second to last game of his career, he played 58 minutes in Game 6 of the NBA Finals to force Game 7 against the Celtics. A Game 7 which they did lose, but the Big O was exactly the player the Bucks needed to get over the hump in the post-Bill Russell era, and looking back, they got him for a laughably cheap package. At number 31, we have Damian Lillard to the Trailblazers. What will eventually become a Hall of Fame career was built in a Trailblazers jersey for Dame time. Dame is one of those perfect examples of a player you'd call the face of a franchise, because he stayed in Portland for over a decade, racked up 7 All-Star appearances, brought the Blazers their first playoff win in over a decade, and stuck around even when the front office continually struggled to build a contending roster. Now, Lillard was drafted by the Blazers, but at the trade deadline before the draft, the Nets traded away Mehmet Okur, Sean Williams, and their first-round pick in order to land Gerald Wallace. And this first-round pick turned into the number 6 overall pick, which the Blazers used to draft Damian Lillard. In hindsight, this trade paid off for the Blazers in a way that neither franchise could have ever predicted. But maybe the Nets should have held on to their first-round pick. They have a bad habit of doing that, as we'll talk about later in part 4. Even though the Blazers failed to build a championship roster around Dame, this trade was still excellent because it gave the Blazers one of the best point guards in the league, and they did so by rightly gambling on another team's draft pick. At number 30, we have Kyrie Irving to the Cavs. Another one of the best point guards of the 2010s, Kyrie Irving spent his first 6 years with the Cavs, developing a reputation for having a flashy ball handle and an excellent scoring ability. The second half of these years was definitely more memorable though, because he was playing alongside LeBron James, competing for championships. Like the Lillard trade, this trade was a trade deadline deal before the draft in which the Clippers traded away Baron Davis and their first round pick in order to land Mo Williams and Jamario Moon. This trade was another lesson to not trade away your first round pick at the trade deadline, because even though this pick had a 2.8% chance of being number 1 overall, it was the number 1 overall pick in the draft that the Cavs used to draft Kyrie Irving, and the Clippers literally got no significant assets to show for it. 5 years later, and Kyrie Irving averaged 27 points on remarkable efficiency in the series that brought the Cavs their first championship in franchise history. So here we have a deal that was so unbelievably worth it for the Cavs that it's just embarrassing for the Clippers. Our next trade at number 29 is Alex English to the Nuggets. English's career does not get talked about enough. Here we have a guy who is top 25 in most points scored in NBA history for his career. Also a guy who was constantly at the top of the league in points per game, even bringing home a scoring title in 1983, and still to this day has the most points in Nuggets franchise history as a result of this trade. To land him, they traded away George McGinnis in order to get Alex English and a first-round pick in 1980. This package goes to show how unproven English was at this point in his career. But he would go on to spend over a decade with the Nuggets, becoming one of the deadliest scorers in the league and the face of their franchise. Sadly, the Nuggets never built a roster around English that would legitimately contend for the championship. The closest they came being in 1985 when they lost in the conference finals to the Showtime Lakers, a series in which Alex English played his heart out, averaging 30 points and shooting 51% from the field. But English still made 8 All-Star appearances and built a Hall of Fame career in a Nuggets jersey, a career that nobody expected, especially not the Pacers when they made this deal back in 1980. The next trade we got is Luka Doncic to the Mavericks. We know Luka today as one of the best players in the league, but this was not the unanimous perspective on Luka as a draft prospect in 2018. People said all sorts of things about him, like he was too slow and not athletic enough, and perhaps the only team that was wise enough to see through this was the Mavericks, because on draft night in 2018, they traded up from the 5th overall pick to get the number 3 overall pick and draft Luka, while the Hawks drafted Trae Young and also got another first round pick in the package. This deal was looking like a win-win at first, but Trae Young is nowhere near the level of Luka Doncic. In his 6 full seasons with the Mavericks, Luka averaged 29 points, 9 rebounds, and 8 assists, and he was already making the All-NBA first team as soon as his second year in the league. His best year was his last year, in which he got the scoring title, averaging 34 points a game, 9 rebounds, and 10 assists a night. He also was an MVP candidate and brought the Mavericks all the way to the NBA Finals before they lost to the Celtics. Now, why did the Mavericks trade him after a season like this? I still have no idea, but the Mavericks were still wise enough to recognize that a generational talent was slipping in the draft and then made the right move to acquire him. The next trade we have is Kawhi Leonard to the Raptors. If you're wondering how high a trade can rank for a player that only plays one season for your team, then this trade will answer your question, because there is no better one season that the Raptors could have gotten out of Kawhi Leonard than the one they got here in 2019. Kawhi was a longtime San Antonio Spur but requested a trade in 2018, and the Raptors decided to take a chance, trading away their longtime star DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a first-round pick in order to get Kawhi Leonard, Danny Green, and $5 million. In the one season Kawhi spent there, he averaged just under 27 points and 7 rebounds a night. But the real significant part of this trade is the fact that the Raptors were not able to succeed in the Eastern Conference before this trade, but with Kawhi, they finally made it to the finals and won the NBA championship, the first in Raptors franchise history, with Kawhi being the finals MVP, averaging 28.5 points and 10 rebounds in the finals. I'm only mentioning box score stats here, but Kawhi was also guarding notable scorers on opposing teams during this playoff run, including Giannis, Klay Thompson, and Steph Curry, and Kawhi was an excellent defender, rising to the challenge on this end of the ball as well. Now apparently, Kawhi was certain that he was not spending another year in Toronto as soon as his contract was up, so he only spent one season in Toronto. But for a roster that had failed to see playoff success, and for a franchise that had yet to win their first franchise title, what more could you ask out of a trade like this? And for our last trade before we break into the top 25, we have Jayson Tatum to the Celtics. Despite coming off a season in which they were the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference and made it to the Eastern Conference Finals, the Celtics ended up with the number 1 overall pick, courtesy of the Brooklyn Nets. So the Celtics had a decision to make. Do they take one of the top prospects, Markelle Fultz or Lonzo Ball? Or do they trade this pick away and land a star talent to further help this Celtics roster compete for a championship? Well, what they ended up doing was trading back from number 1 to number 3 overall, and also getting a first round pick in the deal. They already had their star guard Isaiah Thomas in the backcourt, who they were about to trade for Kyrie Irving, so they didn't need a guard, and plus, they liked a wing prospect named Jayson Tatum better anyway. And rightfully so, because Tatum became a far better player in the NBA than Fultz or Lonzo ever were. And instead of trading this pick away for somebody in their prime years, they got somebody that would become the face of their franchise for years to come. As Tatum is still with the Celtics and has racked up 6 All-Star appearances and 5 All-NBA teams, and is only 19. Also, Tatum was the leader of the Celtics team that won 64 games and won the championship in 2024, with Tatum winning the Finals MVP trophy and the Celtics hoisting their 18th banner. In 2017, the Celtics were in a unique predicament, and there's really no better decision that they could have made than the one they made here. And as a result of this deal, the Celtics still benefit from Tatum's superstardom to this day.